Hello to the audience. My name is Dr. Vishwas Satgar. I'm the principal investigator for Emancipatory Futures Studies in the Anthropocene at the University of Witwatersrand. This short input is for the Wits University Edinburgh Sustainable African Futures Doctoral Program. I will be speaking to the theme, The Politics of Knowledge and Emancipatory Futures Making in Africa. I'm not going to speak to sort of the politics of knowledge as it relates to sociology, although I will draw a bit on that. And neither would I speak to the politics of knowledge as it relates to the natural or physical sciences. I will allude to that and I will gesture to that. But I'm coming at this topic from the standpoint of decolonial politics, from the discipline of international relations, and of course, my Emancipatory Futures Studies project. Why our slides are not working? Yeah, it is. Okay, so the first theme I want to speak to relates to the crisis of hegemonic knowledge. Now, we are living in a world that has, for the past 500 years, constructed a world centered around Euro-America. And Euro-America basically gives us an epistemology that's centered around reproducing this Euro-American world. And in that process, it reinforces coloniality. So formal colonialism might have disappeared from our midst, but coloniality continues in this matrix of power. There's a correlation between geopolitical hierarchies of knowledge and, of course, the imperial universals and civilizational standards that center this Euro-American world, and of course, its epistemology. This world is in crisis and is being resisted increasingly as there's a redistribution of power in the world. The second point I want to make elaborates on this point of crisis. We are now living the fourth great crisis of capitalism, and Euro-American civilization is implicated in this crisis. It has engendered this crisis. It is making this crisis. And this crisis is also an epistemological crisis. The Euro-American world has placed itself at the center of world history as being, if you like, a supremacist dominant center. But at the same time, it has been implicated in an ecocidal logic of the mass-scale destruction of human and non-human life. And at the same time, through its supremacy, it holds up a conceit that it can solve the polycrises we are living, but actually it can't. It is immersed in, if you like, a set of dogmas, and it is not self-reflexive enough to understand why it has brought us into this crisis. It is not capable of thinking beyond its own world making. The third point about the crisis of hegemonic knowledge that I want to register in our exchange is that the modern university has given us disciplinary boundaries. And these disciplinary boundaries give us specialities, they give us expertise in particular fields and domains. But there's a problem when our disciplinary boundaries meet the current crises of socio-ecological reproduction. These are crises that display a complexity and interconnections, which really show up and upend, if you like, the limits of narrow disciplinary thinking. These crises foreground the ontology of our life worlds. In other words, it forces us to really think about what needs to be centered in our existence, what needs to be centered in our knowledge projects. And essentially, the crises we are living are prompting us to center Earth relations. And when I say Earth relations, I'm talking about this thin envelope called the biosphere, in which there's a succession of life, there's a proliferation of life, and within that you have ecosystems and nested ecosystems, and you also have Earth systems. And so this crisis is forcing us to really think about this relationship. It is forcing us to think about a conception of humans in nature, which has been something we have been divided from in the context of the Euro-American world. So we are being invited by crisis to become socio-ecological beings. We have to revisit, affirm, and validate in this context indigenous science, philosophy, and the archives that go with indigeneity. This is not about a romantic reaffirmation, but this is a recognition that the erasure that has come with the Euro-American world has, if you like, disadvantaged us in many ways in terms of ways of being in relation to nature. The other point about the crisis of hegemonic knowledge today is the impact of neoliberalism, the central dogma of contemporary Euro-American civilization. And neoliberalism, with its dogmatic fixation on markets and the power of corporations, their power over us, has actually created a crisis for the 21st century knowledge project. Our universities are increasingly embodying this crisis with the corporatization of our universities, and of course, the increasing privatization of knowledge, creating knowledge as a commodity. And this, of course, comes with its own perverse practices and its own challenges to the knowledge project. So, in this context of the crisis of hegemonic knowledge, the knowledge that is used to rule over us, the knowledge that is used to dominate us, the knowledge that is used to discipline and control us, we have to ask, where do we locate sustainable development and sustainable African futures? So my second theme in this conversation is emancipatory futures in a heating world. And in this regard, I'm trying to shift our conversation to the whole question of decoloniality. Now, the starting premise of emancipatory futures studies is that the subaltern, the wretched of the earth, can think, can anticipate futures, and can engage in world making. So in other words, this is not the preserve of elites, of technocrats, of politicians, of business schools, of corporations. Every human being on this planet has the potential to engage in emancipatory world making. So this is the first very important starting point. It's validating the collective intellectuality of our societies. The second important point about emancipatory futures making is that it seeks to go beyond the Euro-American centric standard of civilization and its ecocidal logic. If you like to cite an African decolonial scholar, Sabelo Ndlovu Gacheni, we have to deprovincialize Africa. That means we really have to unearth Africa's knowledge, and it's a point I'll come to just now. The third important premise is that we need to break with linearity in world history. In other words, we need to be thinking about multilinearity in world history. We're all not about becoming copies of Euro-America. We are not all about aspiring to the standard. We are all not just passive conscripts of Euro-American civilization. We are seeking another way, and that is African solutions for African problems. Implicated in this, and in the high stakes of all of this, is a very important question, which decolonial scholars from Walter Mignolo to Gaceni and many others have been asking us. What were we? What was the pre-colonial self? So we've had colonial erasure of our cultural heritage, of our histories, of our ways of being. But as part of the decolonial project, we have to look back again critically to kind of refine this thread of who we were as beings in nature. The other point about all of this is that emancipatory knowledge is about the capacity to act transformatively. Now, this is the connection with, if you like, reclaiming our knowledge commons and our knowledge inheritance in this continent, which is under-researched, which has not been given the kind of attention that it needs to be given. We need to restore our understanding of who we are. We have to create new knowledge, and we have to imagine new socio-ecological systems that can sustain life. This is central to emancipatory knowledge making. And that means emancipatory African knowledge, as part of the larger human knowledge project, has to develop its science, its philosophy, its history, its culture, its indigenous knowledge, its tacit knowledge, and so on. This slide talks to Africa's decolonial history and the defeat of African world making. And we've got to situate this question of sustainable African futures in this brief historicization of Africa. I think the first important issue that looms large is that Africans have been engaged in world making. They have advanced Pan-Africanism over 1 century in response, actually, to the infamous Berlin Conference of 1885, which carved up our continent based on the whims of colonial interests. And Pan-Africanism was an answer by Africans to that colonial challenge. Self-reliance was another paradigm of thinking that informed the Economic Commission for Africa and was really about trying to think about a different way forward for Africa in its decolonization process. De-linking was a very, very important concept articulated by one of Africa's most critical intellectuals, Samir Amin. And again, this was about a paradigm to ensure that Africa inserted itself in international relations on its terms. It did not compromise its imperatives and its needs. And then, of course, you also had different brands and versions of African socialism. So Africans were engaged in world making for a greater part of the 20th century, but Africa's decolonization projects were defeated. It was defeated through coercion and violence, the assassinations, murders, coups d'etats, and killings of some of our greatest minds. The Cold War curtain is drawn on Africa on April 10th, 1993, with the assassination of Chris Hani in South Africa. We also lived through the creation of shallow market democracies on our continent. And these democracies have been choiceless democracies. These have been democracies that have favored the surveillance interests and powers of the IMF, the World Bank, and international lenders, as opposed to the power of citizens. We've had structural adjustment programs. Africa has, since the 80s, over 300 structural adjustment programs, and it has been a disciplined continent, beholden to its international creditors. Africa is currently sitting at a debt of about $500 billion. The noose around its neck in terms of structural adjustment owed debt is tightening all the time. And many of these countries are becoming unviable. And of course, we've created lumpen elites that do not serve the interests of African peoples. Annually, there's about $50 billion that leaves our continent through illicit financial flows. It is these elites that work with transnational corporations and further defeat our continent. So Africa remains an imperial subject in a heating world. If you look at the green transitions that are planned and envisaged in Euro-America, whether through Biden's Inflation Reduction Act or the Green Deal in Europe, driven by the European Commission, well, they have made sure that they secure the minerals and resources that are necessary for these transitions. And many of these resources, including, by the way, gas, is going to come from Africa. So Africa's fossil fuels are being targeted, our strategic minerals, everything from copper to cobalt, and our rare earths are all being extracted and are meant to be, if you like, part of unequal ecological exchange, something that we are very familiar with going back to slavery. So Africa is also living the polycrisis of Euro-America. We saw during COVID-19 that we were expendable. Euro-America was more concerned about patents and ensuring its people were vaccinated. And Africa was, if you like, the victim of vaccine apartheid. Africa is also experiencing extreme climate shocks. It is intensifying in terms of droughts, cyclones, heat waves, and at least 200 million Africans will be displaced in the coming decade. But yet Africa, with the exception of South Africa, did not create this problem. Africa is bearing the brunt of climate injustice created by Euro-America. And so I'd like to conclude with a message around contemporary African emancipatory futures making. So despite the defeat of our continent and its own contribution to world making, Africans are still fighting back. And Africans are fighting on different fronts. And they're trying to create a new Africa. They are trying to create a new set of relations with the world. In the first instance, I would like to highlight the importance of communal land in Africa and its oceans. There are about 800 million Africans that are still existing under communal land tenure systems. Only 4 out of 54 countries have abolished communal land systems. So sharing land, sharing water resources is very central to the African condition. And what we are seeing in practice is an attempt to strengthen people-led commons management systems. We are beginning to see efforts at biodiversity protocols on our continent to preserve Africa's natural commons. In South Africa, between 15 and 20% of its land is still in customary ownership systems. But again, this is coming under threat from mining and further extraction. And so a very serious battle line is being drawn here, what I would call the last great dispossession of the commons. But it's in these struggles that the next Africa is being made. The second important example of emancipatory futures making is woman. It's a women's-led movement on our continent, fighting extractivism, fighting against the debt noose around Africa's neck, fighting to recognize the climate injustices on our continent. Woman operates in more than 16 countries on our continent. It is advancing systemic alternatives to extractivism. It is in a process of deep dialogue amongst peasant women, urban-based women, grassroots women on our continent to culminate a process of reimagining an emancipatory ecological feminism and a renewed radical Pan-Africanism on our continent. In 2024, Woman will culminate this dialogue and present its vision for a new Africa. The third important example of African emancipatory futures making is the African Food Sovereignty Alliance, which works across possibly over 30 countries on our continent. And AFSA is at the front line of rejecting the so-called Green Revolution of the Gates Foundation and the G7 Alliance. The research they've done and the campaigning they have done shows that the Green Revolution in Africa, like in parts of Asia, East and South Asia, is a disaster for our continent. It leads to winners and losers, dispossessions and displacements. And even in the countries that have been poster childs for this Green Revolution, there has been continued poverty and inequality. The Green Revolution has founded, is not working on our continent, and is not the way forward. In this context, AFSA is arguing for African governments to prioritize food sovereignty systems, agroecology, to allocate resources, and build the next food system based on the current commons-based systems that we have on the continent. And lastly, the Climate Justice Charter movement in South Africa is the harbinger of the first climate justice charter in the world. And in that charter, it explicitly makes a call for a climate justice deal for Africa. This is a climate justice deal that recognizes that Africa has not created the climate problem, but yet is bearing the brunt of injustice. It recognizes that Africa is owed a climate debt. It recognizes that Africa also needs to be remunerated for loss and damages. It recognizes that Africa has resources that the world needs for the just transition, and that Africa should organize collectively around those resources and use the leverage of those resources to ensure that its people are not harmed in the context of the worsening crisis. The climate justice deal for Africa is a rallying call also for the renewal of radical Pan-Africanism. So in short, and to conclude, if we are thinking about sustainable African futures, these are very, very important struggles and movements on the African continent that are attempting to achieve such futures. Thank you for your time.